So what if the real reason you pay taxes isn't actually because of, like, some noble social contract we all just agreed
It's
to?
a whole civic duty thing we're taught.
Yeah, exactly. What if it's just because thousands of years ago, the invention of farming suddenly made it really profitable for local thugs to basically steal your wheat?
It is a totally jarring way to look at the world. I mean, framing literally everything through this lens of who can profitably wield force.
Really is.
But, if you strip away those civic myths we learn in school, you really start to see the raw mechanics underneath. Because the stories we tell ourselves about human progress, they often just completely ignore the underlying physics of power.
Which is exactly why today's deep dive is going to build you an X-ray machine for history. Because, you open up your feed today in 2026 and you see the headlines, the geopolitical friction, the economic shifts, and it just feels like this chaotic blizzard of information.
Oh, totally. It's completely overwhelming.
But we have a set of sources today that sort of strips away all that noise. We're looking at this highly visionary, honestly mind-bending text from all the way back in 1997. It's called The Sovereign Individual by James Dale Davidson and Lord William Rees-Mogg.
And our mission today is really to extract the core mental models from this book, specifically how these authors predicted the collapse of the traditional nation state.
Right, and the rise of this entirely new cyber economy.
Exactly. And just to set the tone right away, we should clarify the author's scope here because they do use the word apocalyptic to describe their work.
Which sounds terrifying, honestly.
Yeah, it sounds like doom-mongering, but they actually use it in its original Greek sense. The Greek word apocalypsis literally just means an unveiling.
Okay, an unveiling.
Right. The goal isn't to say the sky is falling. It's about removing the blinders of the industrial age so you can actually see the new boundaries of human potential.
Unveiling the future by exposing the hidden logic of the past. I love that. And, to understand this unveiling, we have to look at the fundamental mechanism that the authors argue drives literally all of human history.
And it is a bit brutal, we should warn you.
It really is. They claim history is driven by the logic of violence. They actually break human society down into four major stages. So you've got hunter-gatherer societies, agricultural societies, industrial societies, and now the fourth stage, which is information societies.
And the really key thing here, the defining characteristic that separates each of those stages, isn't culture or art or philosophy.
Right.
It's simply how violence is organized. Historically, people resort to violence for a very basic reason. It pays.
It's just a grim economic calculation.
Exactly. I mean, if you're an ancient warlord, raiding a neighboring village for their winter food supply pays off, or if you're a 20th century empire seizing an oil field pays off. The scale changes, but that underlying logic remains exactly the same.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit because I'm trying to picture how that translates to the shift we are seeing right now, the information age.
Yeah, it's a huge shift.
The authors point out that throughout the agricultural and industrial eras, there were these massive technological advantages to controlling violence on a macro scale. And that's why we got huge empires and massive nation states, right?
Right. The industrial age was really the absolute peak of that macro violence because, think about it, to project power back then, you needed immense physical capital.
Like tanks and factories.
Exactly. Think about what it took to cripple another nation's economy in the 20th century. You needed a literal fleet of bomber planes, aircraft carriers, this sprawling industrial supply chain to build those machines.
And millions of taxpayers to fund the whole operation.
Right. The state basically had a natural monopoly on power because the barrier to entry was just unimaginably high. No regular person could afford an aircraft carrier.
So is it sort of like a massive corporate monopoly suddenly losing its economy of scale? Like, think of a legacy giant getting completely outmaneuvered by agile little startups doing the exact same thing cheaper and faster.
That is a perfect analogy. The cost of projecting power is just falling off a cliff right now. Microprocessing completely downsizes the scale required to deal damage.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Because today, a small group of independent hackers operating from, like, a basement somewhere, they can shut down a national pipeline.
Or paralyze an entire financial system. They can literally inflict the kind of economic devastation that used to require that entire fleet of bomber planes. The technological leverage has completely inverted.
That inversion really explains why the authors saw the collapse of communism in 1989 as this early evidence of the nation-state starting to erode.
Exactly.
But there is a much darker side to this equation, isn't there? I mean, if the payoff for organizing large-scale state-level violence falls, the payoff for small-scale, localized violence jumps.
Skyrockets, yeah.
The text predicts this natural rise in organized crime and localized disorder,
Mm.
basically operating like microparasites feeding on a dying system.
Yeah, and the text really forces you to look at human behavior not as a series of moral choices, but purely as a response to incentives.
It's following the math.
Right. When centralized authorities lose their overwhelming technological advantage, the local warlord or the cartel or the digital extortionist suddenly finds that violence, or at least the threat of it, becomes highly profitable again on a microscale.
I have to push back a little on this premise, though, because, I mean, doesn't human desire drive history? Didn't people consciously want the progress of agriculture or the freedom of democracy?
It's what we like to believe, for sure.
Right. We like to think we are in the driver's seat, making these grand philosophical leaps forward.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the authors argue strongly against that whole idea. They really don't think human desire drives systemic change. Yeah, large groups of people don't just wake up one day and decide to change their entire way of life out of boredom or like a sudden philosophical awakening. They change because they are absolutely forced to respond to external necessities.
Mhm.
And this actually brings us to their unorthodox framework for analyzing history, which they call megapolitics.
Megapolitics.
Right.
Looking from the outside in at these hidden variables that alter the boundaries of power.
Exactly.
And they highlight four main variables here, right? Topography, climate, microbes, and technology. And the topography one is just fascinating to me.
It's so counterintuitive, but it makes so much sense.
The authors contrast ancient Greece with ancient Egypt to show how geography basically dictates political power.
Right, so take Egypt. It's essentially a desert bisected by a single river.
The Nile.
Right, so survival depended entirely on irrigation from that one source. Controlling that scarce water required massive, centralized coordination. You had to mobilize thousands of laborers to dig canals and build dams.
So you need a really strong boss to make that happen.
Exactly. That geographic reality practically birthed Oriental despotism. The pharaohs held all the power simply because the environment demanded a centralized authority to manage the water supply.
But then Greece was the complete opposite. It had all these deeply indented coastlines, meaning most farmers were incredibly close to the sea.
Which is a huge logistical advantage.
Right, because that proximity allowed them to cheaply transport high-value crops like olive oil and wine by boat. And that cheap transport actually enriched the small, independent farmers.
They weren't just subsistence farming, they were making a real profit.
Yes, and they accumulated enough wealth to actually buy their own hoplite armor, the heavy bronze shields and spears.
And that changes everything, because they could independently arm themselves and form those military phalanxes. They could defend their own property. They didn't have to rely on a centralized warlord for protection.
So the geography distributed the military power to the middle class.
Exactly. And once you have distributed military power, distributed political power inevitably follows. You get the birth of democracy.
So it wasn't some philosophical miracle.
Not at all. It was literally a byproduct of indented coastlines.
That is wild. But, topography only dictates where wealth can be moved and who can defend it. What happens when the fundamental ability to grow that wealth changes overnight?
Well, that brings us to their second variable, which is climate. Because the transition to the agricultural stage wasn't just because farming seemed like a fun new hobby.
Right. The text notes the hunter-gatherer lifestyle was actually quite leisurely.
Oh, incredibly leisurely. They only worked about 8 to 15 hours a week to secure food.
Which sounds pretty great, honestly.
It does. They even had strict cultural taboos punishing members who engaged in overkill. They didn't want anyone depleting the local game. They were basically just coasting.
Coasting until the end of the Ice Age, anyway.
Right. The climate warmed.
And that warming caused dense beach forests to expand, which choked out the open grasslands. So the large game that these hunter-gatherers totally depended on just died off.
They were completely starved out.
Right. So they didn't invent farming because they were visionaries.
Yeah.
They adopted it out of sheer existential desperation.
And we actually see climate working in the opposite direction later in history, too. In the 17th century, the Earth experienced this sudden cold snap known as the Little Ice Age.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah, it caused widespread crop failures, incomes just plummeted, and the resulting economic depression triggered worldwide rebellions and civil wars right around the year 1648.
So a literal shift in temperature shifted the boundaries of political stability globally.
That's intense.
It really is.
Then you add microbes to the mix. The text points out how the conquest of the New World wasn't primarily the story of superior European weaponry like we're often taught.
No, it was entirely a biological phenomenon. Europeans had lived for centuries in these dense, pretty squalid agricultural cities, living in super close proximity to domesticated animals.
Basically a giant petri dish.
Exactly. And that horrific environment bred a population with hardened immune systems that had survived generations of awful childhood diseases. And when they arrived in the Americas, they brought those microbes with them. The one-way transfer of disease just absolutely decimated the indigenous populations.
Right, presenting this biological advantage that facilitated conquest far more efficiently than gunpowder ever could.
Which all circles back to the sheer impact of technology, specifically the technology of agriculture itself. Because farming fundamentally shifted society by creating something that had never existed in human history before.
Capital.
Yes, capital. A hunter-gatherer can't really hoard a herd of deer, but a farmer can store a ton of wheat in a silo. Land can be claimed. Suddenly you have stationary wealth.
And stationary wealth changes the entire math of violence. Once there is a silo full of grain, well, it can be stolen.
Right, it's a sitting duck.
So this created an immediate need for specialists in violence to protect the harvest. Those protectors formed a warrior class, which eventually evolved into the government.
Taking their cut along the way.
Oh, yeah. They extracted a heavy price, sometimes a 25% rake-off of the crop, literally just for protection.
So, if you really think about it, the authors are basically saying the nation-state is just a highly evolved protection racket birthed by the invention of capital.
That is exactly how they frame it.
Okay, but if these mega-political shifts are driven by inescapable forces, like the shift we are seeing right now with information technology, why do they usually catch the masses, and especially the credentialed experts, completely off guard?
It's a great question. The text explains that every social order has a built-in taboo against predicting its own demise. We literally lack the vocabulary to describe paradigm changes happening right around us.
Because it's too disruptive.
Exactly. Our brains reject the data because it threatens our current status in the system. The authors call this psychological phenomenon persistent make-believe.
Persistent make-believe. And here's where it gets really interesting, because the ultimate historical example they use for this is the fall of Rome in 476 AD.
Such a great example.
When Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus, the last Western Roman emperor, he didn't hold a press conference and declare the empire dead.
No, he didn't burn down the institutions at all.
Right. He kept the Senate, he kept the consuls, he kept the entire facade of Roman law.
Because it was useful to him. And it actually took generations, sometimes centuries, for the people living in the territory to admit that Rome had actually fallen.
They kept playing along.
Yeah, they kept using the titles and following the empty rituals because the truth of the systemic collapse was just way too disorienting.
And the truly counterintuitive part of the Roman collapse is that the absence of that central authority actually raised living standards for the small farmers initially.
Which is wild to think about, right? But the imperial tax collectors disappeared. The farmers were finally freed from these crushing taxes that were taking a third of their yield just to prop up a corrupt, oversized military bureaucracy.
A bureaucracy that couldn't even defend the borders anymore anyway.
Exactly. The old system was dead, but the illusion of it was fiercely maintained by the elites who benefited from the make-believe.
And the authors of our source text applied this exact mega-political lens to their own era in the 90s.
They did, and with scary accuracy.
Right. By ignoring conventional expert make-believe and looking purely at these mega-political fault lines, they successfully predicted the 1987 stock market crash, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the long-term decline of blue-collar wages.
Because they looked at the shifting logic of violence when everyone else was obsessing over political promises.
It's like that classic cartoon trope where Wile E. Coyote runs off a cliff.
Oh, yeah.
His legs are spinning in a blur. He's still looking straight ahead, entirely convinced he's on solid ground. And he doesn't actually fall until he looks down and realizes the Earth is gone.
That is exactly it. The authors are arguing the nation-state has already run off the cliff. They are just pedaling in thin air right now.
Okay, so if the Industrial Age is officially over, what does this new ground we are landing on actually look like?
Well, this is the unveiling of the sovereign individual. The text argues that the information revolution liberates the individual by fundamentally changing the nature of wealth itself.
Wealth is no longer just physical capital. It's not a factory or heavy machinery or a literal silo of grain that a government can just easily locate, tax, seize, or bomb.
Right. Ideas are the new wealth.
Ideas.
Mm.
And those ideas exist in the minds of what the authors call the cognitive elite.
Yes. These are individuals whose economic value comes entirely from their mental output, their specialized skills, and their ability to manipulate information rather than physical labor.
And because their wealth is intellectual, it is hypermobile.
It exists in cyberspace. And the authors describe cyberspace in a way that feels incredibly prescient for a book written in 1997.
Oh, totally. They call it a realm of colorblind anonymity. It doesn't matter if you are ugly, fat, old, or disabled. You vie completely equally with the young and beautiful.
The physical attributes that define so much of the hierarchy in the industrial and agricultural ages just vanish online. It's a pure meritocracy of ideas.
Cyberspace is basically characterized as the ultimate offshore jurisdiction. They call it Bermuda in the sky with diamonds.
Which is such a 90s phrase,
Yeah.
but it works.
It really does. It is a realm that exists completely beyond the reach of physical violence. And because a state's entire authority rests on the threat of physical violence, cyberspace is inherently beyond the reach of traditional political coercion.
Exactly. I mean, a nation state cannot send a physical army to occupy a decentralized network. It just doesn't compute.
They even compare this digital realm to ancient mythology, which I thought was a really striking resonance.
Yeah.
They point out how computer passwords function like the magical invocation Alt Abracadabra, granting access to hidden realms.
And telepresence, like the ability to project your skills, your voice, and your work across the globe instantly. They say it mimics the speed of the gods Hermes and Apollo.
It is almost a return to a magical worldview, but it's enabled by technology.
And this fundamentally transforms the very concept of citizenship, because in the industrial age, you were essentially an asset on a state treasury's balance sheet.
Just a number.
Right. You were born within a geographic border, and you were a captive taxpayer to be milked. But in the cyber economy, because your wealth and your labor can instantly cross borders through fiber optic cables, you transition from being a captive asset to being a customer of government services.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Think about the tools you use every day to do your job. If you are listening to this right now and your work involves software, digital consulting, or creative output, if all your tools live in the cloud, where does your taxable value actually reside?
It's everywhere and nowhere.
Right. If a government charges too much in taxes for the services it provides, or if the streets just aren't safe, you don't have to mount a physical revolution anymore. You just take your economic activity to a better jurisdiction.
You physically move your body while maintaining your income, or you just route your digital business elsewhere. You vote with your feet and your bandwidth.
But this cyber utopia for the cognitive elite creates an inevitable collision course, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because those who currently hold power in the nation state, along with the millions of people who are economically dependent on the old system of mass employment and welfare, they're not going to politely step aside and let this transition happen.
Oh, absolutely not. The authors are brutally clear about the coming friction. This brings us to the transition crisis.
The desperate state.
Right. They use this really vivid metaphor. They say the state has grown used to treating taxpayers like cows kept in a fenced field to be milked. But because of information technology, the cows will have wings.
The cows will have wings. I love that. But when the herd starts flying away, the farmer gets incredibly angry, right?
Furious. Because governments completely rely on that captive tax base to fund their massive debts and social programs. As the wealth migrates to cyberspace, these governments will become bankrupt and desperate.
And desperate entities turn nasty.
Very nasty. To stop the flight of wealth, the text predicts a massive increase in extortion, arbitrary forfeiture of property, capital controls to keep money trapped inside borders, and even totalitarian internet censorship as the state tries to maintain its monopoly on control.
They also point to inflation as a desperate hidden tax. The authors note how fiat monopolies, where a government basically decrees that a piece of paper has value simply because they say so, were heavily abused over the 20th century.
Yeah, we've seen it with the German mark and the US dollar being heavily devalued over time.
Exactly. It's a way to secretly fund government deficits without directly raising taxes on the people.
But the authors predicted, and keep in mind, they wrote this decades before Bitcoin was a thing, that cyber money governed by mathematical algorithms would emerge to completely bypass these government fiat monopolies.
They saw cryptography and math replacing the central bank's printing press.
Yes, further starving the state of its ability to secretly abstract wealth through inflation.
But it won't just be the governments fighting back from the top down, will it?
No, the authors warn of a violent neo-Luddite backlash from the bottom up, too. This will emerge from the middle talents and welfare recipients who feel totally left behind by the cognitive elite.
And this backlash won't just be about economics. The authors say it will be driven by what they call moral anachronism.
Moral anachronism. It's such a crucial concept. It is the friction that occurs when people try to apply the moral strictures of a dying economic stage to a new one.
Right.
It's the self-righteous fury of trying to force the information age to play by the rules of the dying industrial age.
It kind of makes me think of trying to force a migratory Eskimo band to live by the rigid property laws of a settled farming village. The environments dictate entirely different moral codes for survival.
Exactly.
When you try to enforce the old rules on the new reality, it just doesn't work, and it causes massive social friction.
And all that friction eventually leads to a devolution of power. Instead of a world dominated by a few massive superpowers, the authors predict a return to overlapping, fragmented sovereignties.
Like the Middle Ages?
Very much like the Middle Ages. We will see merchant republics operating in cyberspace, akin to the historical Hanseatic League.
Okay, the Hanseatic League. That was that medieval confederation of merchant guilds in Northern Europe, right?
Right.
They basically provided their own protection, formed their own private armies, and enforced contracts across borders completely independent of the actual kings and queens who supposedly ruled the territory.
And that is the exact model the authors foresee for the digital age. Sovereign individuals and digital corporations forming private, encrypted networks to protect their wealth and enforce contracts, bypassing the bankrupt nation-states entirely.
But wait, I have to step in and look at the political reality of this for a second.
Yeah.
Wouldn't the vast majority of people just vote to keep the old welfare state going?
This raises an important question, for sure.
I mean, if capital flight hurts the masses, wouldn't a democracy simply outlaw it? You can pass laws banning the export of wealth.
Oh,
right?
yeah. You can try. But the authors tackle that head-on. They firmly believe that market forces and microtechnology will force society to reconfigure regardless of what people vote for.
Really?
Yeah. Public opinion and traditional voting majorities become essentially irrelevant if the state actually loses its capacity to physically capture the wealth it needs to redistribute.
Ah, I see.
You can vote for a massive welfare program, you can vote to seize digital assets, but if the tax base has securely encrypted its wealth and migrated to cyberspace, the state simply goes bankrupt, trying to enforce the mandate. The laws of megapolitics, the cold hard physics of who can actually project power overrule the ballot box.
Wow. It is just incredible to trace these invisible lines of violence and technology across human history.
It really is an unveiling.
From that very first farmer planting a seed out of climate-induced desperation, creating capital, and birthing the state's protection racket.
To the Roman Senate pretending they were still in charge while their empire crumbled around them.
Exactly. All the way to modern digital merchants operating completely beyond the physical reach of desperate governments today.
And for you, the listener navigating the realities of 2026, the speed of this change is undoubtedly dizzying.
Oh, absolutely.
But understanding this mega-political blueprint from 1997 gives you a distinct, massive advantage today. It allows you to see the shifts in the logic of violence clearly.
Right.
By recognizing that the state's monopoly is waning, you can position yourself to act as a hypermobile customer of government services rather than a captive asset waiting to be milked. You don't have to be caught in the persistent make-believe of the dying industrial age.
We've spent this time talking about how the authors mapped out this incredible cyber economy, a realm they defined as being completely free from the threats of physical violence. But as we live through this reality today in 2026, it leaves you wondering something that wasn't really fully explored back in the 90s.
What's that?
Well, if physical violence loses its power to coerce us in cyberspace, how will society handle the rise of psychological, reputational, or even algorithmic violence?
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah.
Because a digital mob can destroy your livelihood just as thoroughly as a physical one. If the traditional nation-state can't protect you in Bermuda in the sky, who exactly is the sheriff? We've given you the X-ray, but now it's up to you to look at the bones.